Matthew chapter 26. If you weren't here last week, I already have a dry throat, so I apologize. Last week we were talking about the Last Supper. Have you heard of that? The Last Supper has so many elements. Like Peggy even said, hey, there's not going to be enough time to cover all of this. I would challenge you in some of these pivotal moments, especially something like the Last Supper that we celebrate once a month in communion. I would challenge you as a follower of Jesus to say, what is going on here? What are the illustrations about? What are the Old Testament references that maybe the next time you do something like take communion in the church body together, that you would say, this means more to me than it did last time? I would say it was even up until 4 or 5 years ago, I'd say a lot of the things that I knew about the Bible, I was very dependent on listening to a sermon or watching YouTube or listening to lectures. And I think about 4 or 5 years ago, I really started to take seriously the need to really go dig and find it for yourself and not just be dependent on someone else always giving it to you. And so I would just encourage you, if you could take something with you that hopefully Matthew has opened the door to say, you know what, I can get at some of that stuff that I felt like I couldn't find on my own now, I can. So last week we talked about the Passover, the Last Supper. Peggy did a great job. She talked about this plot that's unfolding where Jesus is not only going to die, but he's going to be killed, that people are going to come for him, and it's starting to be a picture that's being painted for us more clearly. And then there's this beautiful story of Jesus being anointed. And if you're reading the story and you kind of know what we know, we're beginning to think, oh, this is an anointing for burial. But of course, the disciples are not understanding this at all, and they're still missing the point. We start to get the language of a new covenant. So if you're reading Matthew for the first time, you're scratching your head thinking, what is that all about? I want to keep reading. And then Jesus says some things at the very end of last week where he is telling Peter specifically, but he's also talking about the others. He's saying there's going to be a moment coming when the shepherd is struck, and his language is what? That the sheep will scatter. And then he gives a specific that who is going to deny their connection to him completely. It will be Peter. And so that's where we ended last week, and where we pick up tonight is in chapter 36. So chapter 36, they are done with the Last Supper. They've eaten their Passover meal, and now it says this in verse 36. I'll give you a second to find it on your phone or your print copy of the Bible. Then Jesus went with them, so those are the disciples minus Judas, who we found out slipped away, to a place called Gethsamane. And he said to his disciples, sit here while I go over there and pray. And taking with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Handful of things going on here that I think are important. First and foremost, who are the sons of Zebedee? James and John. Okay, so we got Peter, James, and John. Before I get into them, I don't know if you noticed this or thought this, but I don't think there's a connection necessarily, but I think one of the cool things about studying Exodus for so long is you start to draw lines or think like, oh, that sounds similar. Do you remember when Moses goes up on the mountain and he brings some people with him, and then he says, actually, you guys got to stay here. Only me and Joshua are going to go a little further. And then he tells Joshua, you got to stay here because now I'm going to go. Do you see that? I thought, sounds a little bit like Jesus. He takes his disciples to Gethsemane, says, you guys are going to stay here. He goes a little further with Peter, James, and John. And then he says, you guys are going to stay here, and I'm going to go over there and pray. And it says that he leaves them there, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled. I want to make a connection before we get too far here. Do you remember a moment not that long ago where Jesus goes somewhere very significant, and he takes these 3 guys with him? Okay, so the Transfiguration. And what was the deal with the Transfiguration? You don't need to know the specifics. Don't be embarrassed. Just like, what's the big picture? What's the deal with the Transfiguration?
The Father comes and tells him, talks to Jesus, and he has with him Elijah and Moses.
Yeah, Moses. Yeah, and it ends the exact same way that his baptism, right? Where he's like, this is my beloved son, listen to him. Okay, so they get to see this, and the transfiguration we talked about, I think I taught that week, and it's kind of this glimpse of what the risen Jesus is like in full glory, right? They get like a glimpse of it. They see it like through a window, just for a split second, and what is their response? Wow, you are on the 3-person Jewish Mount Rushmore. You're as big as Moses and Elijah, right? And then God's voice corrects them and says, no, he is not like Moses and Elijah. He is my beloved son. Listen to him. And so what happens in the transfiguration is that these 3 get an eyewitness account of Jesus' divinity, I guess, is what I would just boil it down to. So they get a glimpse of the risen Jesus' divinity. And of course, it's reeking of all the illustration of Moses shining with God's glory, except Jesus is like the full body thing, right? Okay, so this happens, I think this is, somebody could quote me, but I think this is chapter 17. Yeah, 17. Okay, so this happened in chapter 17. Now, Matthew sets up the story the exact same way. That he takes these 3 with him, and something very important in Jesus' life is about to happen. And it says this, so he takes them with him. He began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me. So this word watch is kind of interesting because it sounds in English like it's like, be the lookout, guys. But what it really means is stay awake. The person who keeps the watch is somebody who is awake to kind of alert somebody. So they're kind of like a lookout, but it's more than just that. It's you got to stay awake. So he's not asking much of them. He's saying, stay right here, just sit down, and here's what I want you to do. Just don't go to sleep. That's it. That's the only instruction so far. But we learn something else about Jesus. His soul is sorrowful even to death. So we're painting this picture that something has majorly shifted in Jesus. If we've been reading Matthew, has there been any other description even remotely close to this that Jesus experiences these type of emotions?
When Lazarus died.
Okay, when Lazarus dies, he weeps, right? Okay. I don't think it quite approaches sorrowful unto death. He's usually using language that like this emotional or spiritual pain is so great that it feels like I'm dying. Some people had said, that people who have experienced this, that this is similar to like a panic attack. Like the full loss of I have zero control and it's all falling apart. I don't know that the Bible is describing that, but people have experienced something similar. So he says, I just want you to watch. And then going a little further, he fell on his face and he prayed, saying, my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. So we're going to talk about this too. This is a cool one. We're going to talk about the cup. And he came to the disciples, and he found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, so could you not watch with me for 1 hour? So we find out that, I don't know about you, but praying for 1 hour, anybody ever timed their prayers before? Has anybody done that? When I was a new Christian, I heard this speaker from Uganda, and he was like, you should pray for 5 straight minutes. And then next week, do 6. It's like, this is how I started, and now I pray 2 hours every single day. And I'm like, 5 minutes, that sounds like nothing. So I just set a timer. I was 19 years old, and I started praying, and I'm like, I've prayed for a lot, and I open your eyes, and it's not even been 5 minutes yet, right? So in one aspect, an hour is a long time, but when Jesus is saying just stay awake for an hour, how many of you would say with near confidence that you could stay awake if your very best friend in the world said, hey, could you just do me a favor and stay awake for an hour? Yeah, but they can't. Yeah.
When they felt that they had eaten a large meal, and then they climbed up the hill there, so they were tired, So you might not, even if your friend asked you to,
You might not be able to. I feel like I would just like go in the standing position, you know? It's kind of the feeling like when Natalie was giving birth to Colton, and this takes much longer than I anticipated watching 30-minute TV episodes my whole life. We were like, oh, I don't want to be the guy who just dozes off, so you just got to stand up and walk a little bit, and then you pep it back out, right? They don't even do that. They just get cozy and they fall asleep. So he said to Peter, could you not just stay awake and watch for 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. For the sake of you not having an outline, I want to pause right here and talk about these two things. The first thing is this statement, if it be your will, I will do it. But if there's any wiggle room, I want you to take this cup from me. This idea of the cup, I think it's often connected, and rightfully so, right back to the story we just heard where Jesus has the cup and he's passing it along and he says, this is the new covenant, this is my blood shed for you. So we often hear of this cup and we connect it to blood. And I think in one way this is correct, but this is incomplete. And so I want to talk a little bit about what the cup is, because it turns out the Old Testament has 20, 30, 40 illustrations of the idea of cup. And so I tracked down a handful of these, and you could write them down if you want. Psalm 75 says this. It says that God has this cup of wine, and in those days it's wine that has spices in it and it's warm. It's like a very enticing wine. It's a wine that was what people really liked. It was wonderful to them. And he says that this cup is actually not the good kind to drink. This is the cup of my wrath, and because you have not turned from your evil and your wicked ways, you are going to drink this cup all the way down to its dregs. So he says, the wicked of the earth are going to swallow my wrath. It's time for them to have an account. Well, that's pretty strong language. In Isaiah 51, if you don't know this one, you should definitely look this one up, because this chunk of Isaiah in the 50s there is a lot of what we get the prophetic kind of vision of who the Messiah is going to be, and this is where it comes from. Isaiah 51, I think I wrote down verse 17. It says that it's painting a picture of those who drank the cup of God's wrath, and they are the people who stumble aimlessly. They have no direction because they've wandered away from God's law. So the idea is that they are drunk on their own choosing, and it's because they are drinking the wrath of God for walking away from the law. Jeremiah chapter 25 describes the devastation and the judgment of God for those who are forced to drink the cup of wrath because they refuse to turn from evil. So, this is what the Old Testament, and when I say Old Testament, I think you should be thinking the scriptures that Jesus grew up with. So when Jesus says, let this cup pass from me, the idea of the cup is rooted in a Jewish culture that he knows front and back and back and front. So the idea of cup is not just this blood, it is the wrath and the judgment of God. And I think this is important because I think it gives kind of dimension and depth to what he's saying. Paul tells us that the wrath of God for us was poured out on him. When he's saying, I don't want, my flesh does not want to drink the cup. It's the cup of the judgment of thousands of years of God's people turning from God, refusing to listen, not following the law. Jesus, the one who should not even have to take a sip of this cup, everyone else deserves a sip. He's saying the full thing. Paul says the judgment and the wrath was poured out upon him. So what it's saying is he is drinking the cup that we should have drank. That's the illustration. The wrath and the judgment of God, this idea of like this heaviness and this weight of if you want to get what you deserve, you should drink the entire cup all the way to the dregs. Jesus is saying that is the cup that he is going to hold, And in his own words, he says, "My Father, if it possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." Does this prayer sound familiar to anyone? You remember it from Matthew chapter 5? Teach us how to pray. Do you remember this? Our Father, who art in heaven. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. What is the prayer that Jesus goes back to in his deepest desperation and pain? The same one he taught us, the same one he taught his disciples. When he's looking for comfort in his prayer life at the point where he's fallen on his face and he says he's dying, what is the prayer? It's the same one that he taught us. My Father, this is what I desire, but if not so, my greatest desire is your will, not mine. Isn't that amazing? It's not just this happy prayer that goes on a postcard because he said it back in Matthew chapter 5. It's a prayer that he prays for himself in Matthew chapter 26. So he comes to the disciples and he finds them sleeping. Now, I don't know if there's a connection here at all, but I made a connection, and I think this is really interesting. This comes from chapter 8 of Matthew. This is one of the coolest things about doing verse by verse and chapter by chapter, is we have so much of this narrative now where we're beginning to see, like, Jesus has done this before, but he's reacting different. Why is that so? If you were to go back to chapter 8, there was this early moment in Jesus' ministry where the disciples are trying to figure out who is this guy. And they're in a boat, and a huge storm comes. Do you remember this? And what do? They freak out because they are all going to... So they are in the moment of absolute terror because they feel like they're about to experience death. And in that moment, what is Jesus doing? He's sleeping. So we got this weird kind of comparison. You could probably just draw a line and compare the two. So in the moment when the disciples think they're going to die, Jesus is sleeping. And in the moment when Jesus is experiencing this unto death, the disciples are sleeping. So I was just curious. I haven't thought it all the way through, but I'm just open dialogue. What do you make of that? What are the differences in the scenarios, by the way?
Jesus is in control, though he's asleep.
Okay.
But the disciples are definitely not in control. And it's the flesh that causes no death to be wiped out.
So there's some element of they are interpreting this as our death, and Jesus knows this is not your death, I'm in control. But in this moment, I was thinking, why are the disciples asleep? Are they asleep because they know Jesus is going to go to the cross and they want to get some rest and rest up for the big day that's going to be really hard on them? What are they under the impression of still? Is that what?
In a sense, they're preparing for a war.
Yeah.
Because they think they're going to overthrow the Roman government.
Yeah. And they, at this point in the narrative, have so much confidence that Jesus has got this, that we can just sleep like little babies. We don't have to worry about it. We're taking over Jerusalem first, and then we're going for Rome. Right? And we're so confident of that, we don't even really listen to what he said at that supper. We just tune out all the times he says that something weird's going to happen, he's going to be turned over and then rise. Well, whatever. He's going to Jerusalem, and then we're going to Rome, and we're so confident we could fall asleep. And in this moment, Jesus has experienced not just the fleshly pain, he's experiencing the spirit, the spiritual death. So what's on the line is not just Jesus' physical body. What's on the line is the kingdom of God coming on earth as it is in heaven. You see that? The stakes are not just some, not to be crass, but the stakes are not just some disciples drown in the lake. The stakes are that the entire plan for the kingdom of heaven to come and the incarnate Son is at stake, and Jesus is wrestling it. And they can't interpret that at all because they don't have the right lenses to see it.
And don't you think it was also, his anger might have also not been just that they were sleeping, but they weren't watching.
Yeah.
Aware. They weren't, like you said, the perception.
Yeah. I think he's about to say it, but it's exactly what you're saying, because he says the second time, I think it's the second time around, he says, he came and found them sleeping. You couldn't stay awake an hour. And then in verse 41, he says, watch and pray that you might not enter into temptation. So he's telling them the prayer element for temptation is I'm inviting you into a spiritual battle. This isn't just a physical thing. This is a spiritual battle, and what we're going to find out is, it's a weird thing he teaches. I'm not sure what it means. Let's go back to sleep, right? That's what's going to happen. I just thought that was really interesting, the sleep thing. So this is what it says. Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. It's kind of an interesting word here, but what temptation? You probably know the story from here, at least in part. What are the temptations? Peter, James, and John, what are their temptations that Jesus is inviting them to pray? Maybe the temptation to proclaim that you don't know me. Maybe the temptation to be overcome by fear, so not even to show up at the crucifixion. Maybe the misunderstanding and the temptation to think so that your plan for me is so positive that when it doesn't happen, you just go back to fishing. But they don't. He says, the spirit indeed is willing, but your flesh is weak. Again, for the second time, he went away and he prayed. And here's his second prayer. My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done. You see the tone shift, the language shift? It seems that somewhere in Jesus' first prayer, it's become completely obvious to him that the cup is not going to pass. You see that? The first time he says, if it possible, let this cup pass from me. The second time he says, if it cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done. Your will be done. I will drink it. And man, that's going to be a heavy, heavy price to pay. And again, he came and he found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. They were sleeping because they were tired, says Matthew. I think he's wanting you to chuckle a little bit. I think he's giving you a description like these are children that are in the back seat and they just conk out with the seatbelt around their neck because they just can't handle it. So Jesus doesn't even try to wake them up. He leaves them and he goes a third time. So leaving them again, verse 44, he went away and he prayed for a third time, saying the same words. Then he came to the disciples and he said to them, sleep and take your rest later on. See, the hour is at hand and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. I think what Jesus is saying is this whole thing that I've been talking about, it just started. What you're about to see is all the stuff that you have pushed aside, that you've tried to rebuke me on, that you've been confused and you just ignored it. It's all culminating right here, right now, and it is beginning, and here they come to enact it. Let me flip my page here. I was thinking about this week. Sometimes I get teased or I tease with some folks, including Peggy, that for some reason I think I'm maybe born at the wrong time because, full confession, I don't dislike modern worship music, but I just listen to hymns like on repeat all the time. Any hymn fans? I have friends that are like, I'm 100% with you on the Bible stuff. I can't do your hymns. And I'm like, they're not my hymns. They're history's hymns, and they're theologically rooted, so you should probably listen to them instead of a 20-year-old who wrote a song with 3 chords. Just saying. But do you know the hymn, Jesus Paid It All? All to him I owe. Do you remember there's a part in there that says, child of weakness, watch and pray. And I was thinking, that's what I love about hymns. That hymn is, I just feel like whoever wrote that was reflecting on this story a long time, and they got it. They captured it. Child of weakness, watch and pray, find in me thine all in all. Why? Because Jesus paid it all. So, just had to get some hymn. So if you guys want some recommendations, I know some people that could help you out. The last thing I wanted to say before we move on is this is Jesus at a place that we haven't seen him before. And I think sometimes it makes us uncomfortable because we are a culture that has kind of like bleached and sanitized suffering. Have you noticed that? We don't do public suffering. We've done everything we can in our whole world to mask it, and when we can't mask it, we put it away. Like, this sounds terrible, but it's kind of like nursing home culture. Like, ooh, I don't want to see death coming, so let's just hide it away and pretend it's not there, right? What does our culture love? They love glitz and glam and image, right? Have you ever seen these videos where they show you like a picture of, say, like a supermodel, and they show the progress of what goes before the magazine cover, and they show you, she doesn't even look anything like that. So like the stuff that we look at and people worship is something that's not even real. It's like this vibrancy and this never-ending youth, and we can just live forever, and we don't like suffering. So our culture sees this Jesus, and we get a little queasy, we get a little uneasy. Anybody ever been into a church in another country, like even Mexico or Europe? An old Catholic cathedral has Jesus on a crucifix at the front, and what is the scene? There's blood involved, isn't there? And we don't do this. We don't like that. But I think there's actually a really good news here, and it's that I think many people have experienced a point in their life where they feel like they're dying. Maybe it's physically, maybe it's emotionally, maybe it's like this utter heartbreak and brokenness where you just have nothing left and you just feel like nothing's worth it. Has anybody ever been in that place before? Or there's no prospects, you've exhausted every option, you feel like you've prayed every prayer, nothing's gone your way, and now you either literally or figuratively find yourself headfirst on the ground with nothing. I think the good news for us is that if we listen to what the Word actually says, that when we're in that place, Jesus is in that place. Sometimes we think like we got to have it all together and then we'll go encounter Jesus. How many people would say that some of the most powerful encounters you've ever had with Jesus are at your very worst moments? I think it's because the God of the entire universe knows exactly what that feels like and has a deep connection with you in that moment. Isn't that beautiful? So when we kind of like wash over these things and we're uncomfortable with it, we miss the nugget that God is with you. The Old Testament says, even in the valley of the shadow of death. You don't have to be on the mountaintop to find God. God is with you in that moment. I'm going to take a quick sip, and then we're going to talk about the betrayer. Okay, verse 47. While he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a great crowd with swords and clubs. Hey, by the way, I was thinking, why does Matthew tell you Judas, one of the 12? Like, duh, we've been reading the story. We know who Judas is. I just write so many questions all over my outline. Like, why does he even bother to waste space? Turns out there's a reason. Judas is one of the most common names ever. We might think in our English translation that John is a pretty common name too, but John Smith is like Judas. There's Judas galore. If you read Jewish history, there's like millions of Judases. So I think Matthew just wants to make sure that you know that this is the Judas from the 12. So with him came a great crowd, and they are wielding swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people. So who are these people? They are the extension, the representatives of who? They are the Jewish elites. They are the Jewish temple leaders. So the people they send a hitman crew with weapons. By the way, what time is it? Late at night. I might forget to say this, but it's very interesting to note this, because when they get Jesus and they take them back, guess what's already happened? They just conveniently have a council already convened in the middle of the night. Matthew doesn't ever say it, but he wants you to see that this is a setup. This is a conspiracy from the start. They already have the plan. They know that we can get all the right people, but it'll have to be the middle of the night, so all of his followers don't know what's happening, and that's how we're going to get him. So they come with weapons. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Seize him." And he came up to Jesus at once, and he said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and he kissed him. Jesus said to him, "Friend, do what you came to do." Some of your translations might say, like, "take haste," or whatever you need to do it quickly. They came up and laid hands on Jesus, and they seized him. I want to pause right here really quick. So Judas greets Jesus with a kiss. My pen's running out. Seems strange to us. In the first century, people greeted with a kiss all the time. Especially in this context, what Judas says is, "Greetings, Rabbi." So a couple things we can take in here. The kiss is that this is the greeting of respect and honor due to somebody who's beyond you, right? So this is a greeting. And then the thing I think is interesting is that Judas calls him Rabbi. And I think this is a little glimpse into the heart of Judas. Because yes, he's betrayed him. Yes, he's sold him out for silver. But deeper than that in his heart condition, who does he believe Jesus to be? Rabbi. He doesn't call him Lord. He doesn't use any other. He just calls him Rabbi, teacher. That's who Judas thinks Jesus is. So all that he's seen and all that he's done, we're going to see the other disciples they've got it mixed up too. But they're still wrestling. Judas has made up his mind, Rabbi, so that's what he calls him. He kissed him on the cheek. Jesus responds to him. What does he say to Judas? Friend. Is that interesting? He also just had a meal with him. Is that interesting? Now we're gonna jump on Judas in a second because he deserves it. But there's other betrayals as well. Peter is going to betray Jesus in a way. It's not going to be the permanent way that Judas does. The other disciples, they don't even tell us exactly, but they're going to betray Jesus in a way. And so there's different kinds of betrayal. But I think another little nugget of good news is even in the midst of betrayal, of acting like you don't even know him, anybody want to just say, "I've acted in public like I don't even know Jesus. I'm ashamed of what has come out of my mouth, and I acted in a way that if I step back and think, wow, how I just acted was I don't even know you, Jesus." Is that a betrayal? And in the midst of the betrayal, the worst one, what does Jesus say to Judas? He's not a 5th grade girl that's like, "You are off my top 8 friends," right? He calls him friend. I know exactly what's going on. I understand how you see me and that you're selling me out. I still see you as my friend. I think what's kind of devastating in the story is you all know Judas's end is that he kills himself. But I think if Judas had known that Jesus is not Rabbi, he's Lord, he would also have known that there is forgiveness in Jesus. But because he doesn't know who Jesus is, he doesn't understand forgiveness, and so his end is putting himself to death. Okay, so let's see. Let's get back to here. So, of course. "And behold, one of those who were with Jesus stretched out his hand and drew his sword." Now, Matthew doesn't tell us who, but other versions tell us, and it's totally in character. So who is this guy? Okay, so Peter. He draws his sword, and he struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. Okay, so he just struck the guy who is there representing the numero uno in the temple system, right? So this is like if you're going to attack one guy at the top of the pyramid that came to get you, Peter knows which guy to go for, right? So he draws out his sword, and he lops off his ear. He's got pretty good aim. Or how many of you think he's not aiming for an ear? No, he's not aiming for an ear. What is he aiming for? He wants to cut the dude's head right off. And so he draws his sword. I don't know, maybe he swings it and the guy ducks right at once and gets his ear cut off. So what is Peter's intention? I will kill for you. Wow. Now, right here standing in this moment, I feel like that's very extreme, but I've also been in places where I feel like people are saying things about Jesus or about God, where I get this rise of anger in me, like, I will defend God. How dare you say that? So there's a little bit of it in us, isn't there? So Peter is just brash. He pulls it out. He's probably not done with puberty yet, so he's probably pumping with hormones, pulls that sword out, and he tries to lop the dude's head off, and he gets an ear. And Jesus says, oh, this is an interesting thing. Back in Matthew 5, if you're curious, why do you keep referencing Matthew 5? That's the beginning of what? Sermon on the Mount, exactly. Okay, so this is like the core of Jesus' entire teaching. Jesus taught something. He said, you have grown up in a culture that has taught you an eye for an eye. So what is Peter doing? He's reaching for his sword. You mess with my Lord, I lop your head off. I see it as an equal, tit for tat. Boom, I'm going to get you. But Jesus says, that's the way that you have thought. The way that I want to reframe and reshape your entire living and your entire heart is what? Turn their cheek. And then when somebody hits that one, you turn it again. You expose their shame in an honor and shame culture. You expose their shame by showing them that what they're doing is so extreme. And Jesus is about to say, look, I'm going to show you the ultimate turn the other cheek. And then he says this, do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? So what is Jesus saying? If I wanted to use violence to get out of this, I can do way better than your sword. You may recall all the way back, I can't remember the temptation of Jesus, chapter 4, 3 or 4. This temptation has already been set before him, hasn't it? Where Satan says, call on God for a favor to send angels to, he says, jump off the temple and then God will send angels to catch you. And Jesus has already said, I'm not succumbing to that temptation to call on God the Father, to call in divine favors to somehow protect me against the mission I'm called to do. So he says, Peter, if the plan was to use violence, I could use so much more violence than your sword. Put it back, because those who live by the sword will perish by the sword. Verse 54. But how then should the scriptures be fulfilled that it must be so? So what he's saying, I think, is in Jewish speak, he's saying these people and everything that's happening right here, even though they're not even aware of it, they are part of a much bigger drama that has been orchestrated since the beginning of time. These people think they're just here to arrest me. They are actually walking into a prophecy that's hundreds of years in the making. They are part of this huge mega drama that's happening, and it doesn't end with me using violence. Put your sword away. At that hour, Jesus said to the crowds, this is verse 55, have you come out as against a robber, with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I've been sitting in the temple teaching, and you didn't seize me then. But all of this has taken place that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled. So he says again, the reason this is happening is not because of you choosing to do this. The reason this is happening is because God chose it to be this way from the beginning of time. Then the disciples left and fled. You ever heard that at our core we have two instincts when we come into fear and danger? They are what? Fight or flight. What is Peter's first reaction? Fight. Jesus says, not an option. They all say, well, if we can't pull out our swords and start hacking away, then think this is the crazy thing. Jesus says, these guys who have just showed up with swords and clubs to get me, they are part of this bigger prophetic vision that's been going on and working its way to this point for thousands of years. But you guys are too. Peggy taught on it last week. Jesus quotes the prophecy from Zechariah. The shepherd is going to be struck, and when he does, the sheep are going to scatter. That is not Jesus' words. That's a prophetic scriptures from well before Jesus. So he's not just saying all these bad guys are part of it. He's saying you are too. And all the disciples left him, and they fled. One other interesting connection. We've been reading Matthew, and there's all these really cool lines that we can draw. Jesus says to them, "You come out against me as though I am a robber." Now, this word doesn't show up very often in the Bible at all. This is a pretty interesting word. In fact, I think other than maybe being said multiple times in the same story, it only comes up in 2 stories. This one and which other one? When all this drama was beginning, at the very beginning, remember? Jesus gets angry. This place is supposed to be a house of prayer. You have made it into a den of robbers. So he says the temple has become... Okay, so if the temple has become the den, then who are the robbers? They are the elite ruling Jews. Okay, and we talked about this at the time. What is a den? A den is a place that, like a bear goes out and hunts and then can return to the den and sleep knowing that I'm safe in this place, right? So Jesus is saying the temple is your retreat place where you go out and you screw with widows and orphans and all the people that you're supposed to protect. Then you go back to the place that's supposed to be a house of prayer, and that's your safe zone. It's pretty interesting, right? Now Jesus says this, "You come out against me like I'm the robber." Interesting. Now, what do robbers do? They leave their den to go do sketchy stuff in the dark of night. And then when they're done, where do they go back to? The den. And where is the den? And where are they going to take Jesus? Jesus is like, you guys can't even remember what I told you a couple weeks ago. If you had listened to me then, maybe you wouldn't be standing here. Maybe your names wouldn't be etched in eternity in history as the ones who came here if you had listened. But he says, you come against me like I'm the robber. I've been sitting peacefully in the place where you all reside, teaching every day. What is he doing? He's exposing them for the reality that they need to do this in the dark of night because this is probably not popular with the lowly, common people, is it? Turns out that even lowly, common people are going to desert and betray Jesus too. Because we know from the other accounts, what do? They're very quickly manipulated into saying, give us Barabbas, the murderer. If that's what the whole crowd is shouting, then yeah. I don't want to go against the crowd, so I'll just shout whatever they shout. So he says, all of this happened that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled. And I think he's saying it just got fulfilled because what happens? The disciples all left him and they fled. This is the moment that Zechariah prophesied that the shepherd would be struck and the sheep would flee. The shepherd just got struck, and what happened? The sheep fled. I think this is very interesting. I was thinking about this week. Back in chapter 19, Jesus has this conversation with them, and they say, like, look, some of these people come and go at will, but not us. We did what? We left everything. I think the New King James says we forsook, or we forsake everything that we were to follow you. And now, at the moment where it all comes into what he's been teaching them, what do? They forsake him. I'm going to get another sip of water, and then we're going to talk about this council. Okay, verse 57. Then those who had seized Jesus led him to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders had gathered. So the high priest is just awake in the middle of the night, and he's just convened a council. How convenient, isn't it? So they come back, and they now have Jesus with them. And Peter was following him at a distance. If you have a print copy of the Bible, I would circle that. We're going to come back to that. Because as terrible and nasty as this is going to get, my deepest conviction this week is you follow Jesus from a distance a lot too. You want to see what the outcome is going to be before you jump in, don't you? That's what I felt like God was saying to me, and my honest answer when I was alone was, yes, that's true. I don't want that to be true, and we're so lucky that God is the God of grace and forgiveness, aren't we? Anybody want to just say, I'm with you? So I don't have to say it up here exposed and vulnerable. But that's what Peter's doing. He has an idea that Jesus is supposed to be the king. So maybe those 12 legions of angels, maybe he's going to wait till right at the last moment, then call it, because that would be a Hollywood ending, and I want to be at a distance just in case, so I can rush in and be like, I'm with him. But he's at a distance. And Peter was following him at a distance as far as the courtyard of the high priest. And going inside, he sat with the guards to see the end. What is the end of this story going to be? I want to know. If it gets sketchy, I'm going to bounce. If it makes a turn, I'm right here to jump back in. Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking false testimony against Jesus. Now how hilarious is this? Does that language ring a bell from Exodus? The high priest is seeking what? He's not hearing it. What is he doing? He's encouraging it. Why is that ironic? Because the high priest should know this little thing called the 10 Commandments. And what is one of the commandments? You shall not bear false witness. So the priest's job should be to arbitrate in some way, like a disagreement, like the two of you are disagreeing, and I'm trying to get to the bottom and bring people in to figure out, are one of you bearing false witness? Because if you are, that's against the law of God, right? That's the high and holy way. He's saying, anybody want to create a story and bear false witness against this guy? In the temple courtyard. This is the high priest. I think Matthew wants Jews to know this is how this went down. The high priest is blatantly breaking one of the 10 Commandments. So he's seeking false testimony against Jesus that they might put him to death. That sounds non-10 Commandment-y. But they found none. Though many false witnesses came forward, at last 2 came forward and they said this. This man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days. Did Jesus say that? He did say that. Is this condemning? How many of you would say, it depends? He said he can tear down the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. It's interesting. Now, if you are a follower of Jesus at this point, and you are now fully in the camp of, he's the Son of God, I believe that with all my heart. My faith is in that. I am one of his disciples. When you hear that, what do you hear? That this new temple idea is the kingdom of God. He's been teaching me about that, and I don't totally understand it, but I believe him and I take him at his word, right? If you are a ruling elite Jew and you hear that this man said, what do you hear? Blasphemy, of course. Because what is the temple? This is why they're having an issue. This is why they're talking past each other. Because what is the temple to them? I got a lot of whispering. The temple has this thing in it called the Holy of Holies, where what resides?
God.
God. The presence of God. So if you're saying to me that you're going to tear down the place where the presence of God dwells, you are way outside of Jewish orthodoxy. You got to go. It turns out that, what's his name? Victoria, I don't want to put you on the spot. 1st or 2nd century Jewish historian. He's got the big book. Josephus, there it is. Josephus. Josephus tells a story of a guy not long after Jesus that blasphemes against the temple. And he basically says that at this point we don't even need it. And guess what they do to him? The technical terminology is they fillet him. Yeah, they bring him under oath and he says, yes, I did say that. He is trying to call out the own hypocrisy in Judaism, his own people. And what do? They fillet him. Yikes. That's what this is. So Jesus is saying this. Now the priests didn't hear Jesus say that, so we have a problem. And the high priest stood up, this is verse 62, and he said to Jesus, have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you? So what is he trying to say to him? I think the way that we could boil it down is, did you say that? Is what they just said true? But Jesus remained silent. So is he going to defend himself? Now, I cannot encourage this enough. You've got to go check out the first. Well, you should read the whole book in its context, of course, but I'm also a realist. So you're probably not going to sit down and read Isaiah for bedtime reading. If you were just to peruse a little bit of Isaiah, start in the late 40s and read through the 50s. Because a lot of this would make sense. The reason I'm saying that is that of all the prophets, Isaiah is one of the most, if not the most quoted prophet in the entire New Testament. There's a lot of stuff in there that you would read and be like, wow, I had no idea. I thought that Paul wrote that. No, Paul is quoting Isaiah. Isaiah 53, I think it's in verse 7, says this. It's talking about the Messiah, and it says, he will be like the lamb led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, he will not open his mouth. So what is happening? Another prophetic word about the Messiah is now true. So Jesus pressed, did you say this or did you not? And the high priest and Jesus remained silent. So listen to this. I think this is the gulf between people who recognize who Jesus is and see him as a complete threat to their power. And the high priest said to him, I adjure you. Now this word is kind of an interesting Greek word. It's exarchidzo or something like that. I haven't done Greek in a long time. But it's a legal term. And it means that in this moment, the high priest is basically swearing Jesus into oath. I'm commanding you, and whatever is about to come out of your mouth, the next thing is you are now under legal oath. Now here's the interesting thing. The high priest thinks he has the authority to force Jesus to talk and put him under oath. Now he clearly hasn't been reading the Sermon on the Mount because Jesus is also against oaths, swearing oaths. What does he say? These people, they want to put you under oath here and put you under oath there and compare and contrast. How about this? You just live a life so wholesome and sold out for me that you just say yes. And everybody knows that you mean yes. That would simplify a lot of things, wouldn't it? So this high priest clearly doesn't know that teaching. So he commands Jesus to speak. Which is, don't you think it's hilarious that the high priest at this point, if you believe Jesus is the Messiah, that the high priest would command the Son of God to speak? Don't you? It says in the Old Testament that the Creator calls forth the speech of men. It should be the other way around. This guy doesn't understand where the power dynamics lay here. Jesus remains silent. So I adjure you by the living God. He's trying to swear an oath by the name of God without recognizing that God is sitting in front of him. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. And Jesus said to him, you have said it. But I tell you, okay, so now Jesus says, what does he say? You have said it. What is he saying? You can't pin me down under your oath. You can't come to that conclusion because I tell you. You can only come to that conclusion in faith, right? So you have said it so. And then he says this. Now this is Jesus under oath. Remember that. This is important. So Jesus is now, by their terminology, whatever he says can be held legally against him. So this is what he says. He doesn't just say, you have said it so, and then stop and go back to quiet. This is kind of his last defense for himself, and it's not a defense. It's more of a, here it is, let it all hang out. But I tell you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of the heavens. What Jesus just spoke is another prophecy. Imagine that. Let me write this one down. This is probably the most important one for the night. This comes from Daniel. Got to be chapter 7. I think I wrote it down. Yeah, 9 through I wrote 9 through 14. This comes from Daniel. Just kind of outside the Bible, there's some pretty good evidence that these particular Jews at this time period, when they're thinking about the Messiah, they're not actually thinking about Isaiah or Zechariah. They're thinking a ton about Daniel. The reason is because Daniel has a lot of apocalyptic imagery, and when they look out at the world of the violence and the terror of Rome, and they think of Daniel where is Daniel? Babylon. They see a connection, and they think a lot of what Daniel has prophesied, they're starting to see it. And so they are really in tune with Daniel. So Jesus quotes Daniel. Let me read the quote one more time. I tell you now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. These are kind of masterfully selected words. So this is what Matthew chapter 7, right around this range, says. This is Daniel's vision. And behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like the Son of Man. And he came to the Ancient of Days, and he was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages would bow down and serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which will never pass away. His kingdom is one that shall never be destroyed. So what did Jesus just say to them? What did he just say to them? I am the Son of Man. This is literally where this title comes from. Sometimes we sing it in worship songs, or we see Jesus say it, and we just fall in line. What he's saying, and when he says Son of Man, is from Daniel. And most scholars think this idea of Son of Man is the second Adam. And if that's confusing to you, you're like, what the heck is the second Adam? We'll just talk it out. It's not that difficult. Who was Adam? Okay, and when he was created, he was made perfectly in the image of God, had perfect relationship with God, right? No sin. Exactly perfection. Exactly how God intended humans to be. Well, he went off and sinned. And so humanity has inherited what he started. The seeds of sin have grown quite large. The idea of the second Adam is the second perfect one, the Son of Man of Daniel. And Daniel uses this imagery and says the Son of Man comes before the Ancient of Days, which is a name given to Yahweh, right? And saying that this figure will come And he will establish a kingdom that will be so powerful no one will ever challenge it. Its dominion will be forever, and it will cover the entire earth, all peoples, all languages. And so these people in the temple, they know this stuff really well. And Jesus, I think Jesus does two things. Number one, he knows who he is and he knows what he's come to do, and he knows that that's him. But I think Jesus also knows that this is going to cut them deeply. Like this is going to, I don't even know how to say it without like saying something bad. This is going to irritate them like really bad. Because he just said, I'm the one prophesied, I am the one who's going to establish the kingdom. And so what's the response? The high priest stands up and he tears his robes. Does that explain why he tears his robes? Yeah. And he says, he has uttered blasphemy. What further witness do we need? What he's saying is, we don't need any more. We've all seen it. I am the ultimate authority of the temple. I've seen it. I've heard it. This is plenty. So what is your judgment?
Andy,
Yeah.
I read today and I didn't realize that it was mandate of God that a high priest should not tear his robe.
Oh.
Leviticus, I think 17. I was quite shocked. I'd never seen that. And so for him to do that showed even a greater wrath that he went beyond what God commanded the high priest of.
Will somebody write this down and remind me? I want to look that up. I had no idea.
I didn't either.
It kind of falls in the theme that he's literally doing things that he's commanded not to do. But, yeah, so what's the illustration of tearing a robe? It's the anger and grief combined, right? It's kind of in the same line, but on the other side of sackcloth and ashes, it's the utter grief but repentance. So he's just furious. He cannot believe that somebody is standing in his presence saying this stuff. So he rips his robes, and he says, "What is your judgment?" And they said, "He deserves death." Then they spit in his face and they struck him, and some slapped him, saying, "Prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is it that struck you?" It's interesting to me that this is their first response. It's like the hate and the resentment that's been boiling out just gets poured out in this moment. Yeah, Victoria.
I think it says Leviticus 10:6 and 21:10 for tearing.
Hang on me. Leviticus 10.
10:6. 21:10.
21:10. I gotta look that up. I love that stuff. Leviticus has so much in there, but man, I gotta be honest, to read it from one end to the other is so hard. And then you read chapters and chapters, then you read a verse and you're like, whoa, codes against leprosy. Jesus once touched a leper. This is very powerful. And then you go I have no idea. Oh, wow. And it's got that in there. If you have a really good night of sleep and some really strong coffee, you should pick a day and just read it. Just get it over with in one way, but also notice how rich it is for how Jesus operates in the world. So they spit on him, they slap him. What do they say? Prophesy to us. Who hit you? They're egging him on in this joking, nasty way. They're basically saying, do a party trick. Right? Now they have changed not at all because I can't remember what chapter it was. But do you remember they before were like, oh, if you think that you're the Christ, then prove it by doing what? Give us a sign. Do a party trick to teach us that, right? Prove it. Their heart is exactly where it's at right now. And it's been there and it hasn't changed. Okay, for the sake of time, we're going to jump into verse 69. Now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard. Okay, so back to Peter. And a servant girl came up to him and said, "You also were with Jesus the Galilean." I never thought about this, but I read it a couple times this week, and I thought, it's very interesting that a servant girl is watching all this go on. She's aware of who the guy is who's about to be put to death. And what is her understanding? Or who, as a servant girl, she's probably just heard what whoever her master is has told her. So what does she know about Jesus? He's from Galilee. That's what she knows. Now, we've talked about this before. Where are we in this story right now? We're in the city people, right? These are city people. Galilee is not city people. Galilee it's the sticks a little bit, right? What is she saying? Is it just simply a term of, oh yeah, Jesus, the guy from Galilee? Because she could have just said, oh, you're with Jesus, that guy right over there. What is she doing? She's throwing a little shade on him. There's people out there, she's probably been told, that think the Messiah came from the sticks, Galilee, right? How do those city slickers like the country? I think there's still the stereotypes for a reason. You can listen to country music and hear one side, you can listen to rap music and you can hear the other side, right? Just going at each other. So that's what she says. But he denied it before them all, saying, I don't know what you mean. Okay? So what does he say? I don't know what you mean. Does he flatly deny Jesus? It's kind of like a brush off, I don't want to talk about my connection, but he doesn't say, I don't know him. She says, aren't you with Jesus the Galilean? And he says, I don't know what you mean. So what is he doing? Deflecting, right? Just a deflection. So you could say, denial number 1 is a deflection. He's trying to deflect that he's associated with him. And when he went out to the entrance, another girl, servant girl, saw him, and she said to the bystanders, hey, this guy right here, he was with Jesus of Nazareth. Right? Again, Nazareth, Galilee, they're just, where is he from? I don't know, he's from out there somewhere, right? These crazy country bumpkins. And again, he denied it with an oath. Whoa, whoa, whoa. I have always read through chapter 26, like, I don't know about you, but when I get to this part, I often speed read because I want to get to the end. I want to get to the risen Jesus. I don't want to sit in it. So I haven't really noticed all these things. So he denied it a second time. This time he did it with, okay, so let's see. The first one, number 1, is just like a petty deflection. He just kind of denies, I'll say he denies an association. Okay? Number 2, now he's getting pressed again. And people do this, right? If you're denying something, even if it's something you're denying because it's true, and people aren't believing you, what do? You just double down, right? Like my 3-year-old does this, Dad, I really, 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 really want that, right? He's doubling down, I want you to know how much I mean it. So he says, again, he denied it with an oath. So we just learned that the high priest doesn't know that Jesus doesn't take oaths. And now Peter shows us what? That he doesn't seem to remember that Jesus says don't take an oath. So he takes an oath and he says, I do not know the man. So the second one is a binding oath denial. And by an oath, it means that legally this testimony could be used. Well, this is a little nuance, but I'm curious how much people would have picked up on this in the first century. So he swears an oath, but who does he swear an oath to? A servant girl. What do you know about kind of the court system in the ancient world? Can she hold him to his oath? No. No. She has 0 standing. He would, if this were played out, he could just literally say, it couldn't even get pulled before a court because somebody could say, did you say that? No. Well, if it's your word versus hers, you win. That's how this would work. So is he taking advantage in some way that I can get these pesky servant girls off me because they don't matter. I can say whatever I need to say. After a little while, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, so now this is multiple people. bystanders, at least two, plural. They came up to Peter and said, "Certainly you too are one of them." Whoa, you're one of those people. Why? Because your accent betrays you. You talk country. We in the city. That's what they're saying. Clearly you have followed him because you are not city folk, you are country folk. Right? Then he began to, yikes. He began to invoke a curse on himself and swear. Now, I've given this some thought this week. In the heat of denying something, whether it's true or not, how many of you would say in the heat of that moment you have like a ton of control of the words coming out of your mouth? Just super heated. Breck, Debbie, don't give yourselves away. They just looked at each other and laughed. So I wonder if in this moment Peter even recognizes what he's doing. Do you guys think he does? No. I have a hard time thinking someone in their late teens, having just pulled out a sword and tried to slam a guy's head off, has got a whole lot of control right now. But whether he has control or not, you see the progression of the denial. The denial is, yeah, I don't know what you're talking about, leave me alone, to, I thought I told you, I swear I don't, to, gosh, I already told you twice, I swear a curse upon myself if I'm lying to you, right? He's building it up. I don't know the man, and then immediately the rooster crowed. When that rooster crowed, I think a couple things happened. I think it says, number one, he immediately remembered the saying of Jesus, that before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times, so he remembers that. And then I think he probably pauses and reflects on what he just did. And what is his response? He went out and he wept bitterly. It's all come rushing back to him. Now, Peggy taught this last week, that I don't think it's just these 3 denials. I think the denials carry even more weight because of the things he had said earlier in the chapter. Do you remember what he said? I'll read it to you. So Jesus basically says, hey, the shepherd will be struck, the sheep will scatter. When I am raised up, I will go before you into Galilee. This is same chapter, chapter 26, just right before our chunk tonight, verse 33. Peter answered him, though they all fall away because of you, I will never. He's basically saying, I'm better than the other 11. Even if they abandon you, Jesus, not me. Jesus said to him, truly, I tell you, this very night before the rooster crows, you're going to deny me 3 times. And then Peter said to him, even if I must die with you, I will not deny you. Remember that part? Even if I must die with you, I will not deny you. Now here's the opportunity. Do you want to say yes and die with him or deny him? So not only have you denied him 3 times just like he said, but you've proven to your own self that you are a liar. And I think when all of this gets kind of rushed into one single moment in time, the only response for him is to realize his brokenness and his sinfulness. And what does he do? He weeps bitterly. I don't think that needs... It's like the ugly, ugly cry. But I think to circle all the way back, this is a nasty place to be. This is the very lowest low for Peter. But we just said this, that at your lowest of lows, Jesus meets you there, right? Now, this is interesting. I didn't know this. This is new information to me. I went back and looked. In Matthew chapter 28, that's where we get the Great Commission. It says that the 11 disciples gathered in Galilee, and Jesus gives them the Great Commission. But in Matthew, Jesus doesn't have this interaction with Peter where he reinstates him. So the last time that we ever hear of Peter in Matthew's gospel by his first name, it's this. And then his part of the story is over. Is that interesting? I think it almost begs, I think this is what Matthew is really good at. You just leave Peter there. I got to know more. I got to read more. What else is available? What happened to Peter? I want to know more about that. Isn't he such an expert at that? He just kind of dangles it out there and then lets you do it. I think this is the genius of how God empowered Matthew to write. So I think the one question I think I would encourage you to write down, and maybe even linger right now and talk about, is this idea of Peter following from a distance. I think a distance is safe. You know, Danny quotes this a lot. I like the quote also. It's from Chronicles of Narnia, where Aslan is described, and it's, is he safe? You remember this quote? No, but he is good. I think we're desperately sometimes following from a distance trying to decide if this is going to be safe. And I don't think Jesus promises that. In fact, Peter gets back on the horse and follows Jesus, and where does his story end bodily? He gets crucified hanging upside down. And I think Peter would say that is his worst moment, not getting crucified upside down. In fact, he elected it. History tells us that he said, I don't want to get hung on a cross like Jesus. I'm not worthy. Just hang me upside down. That's not the lowest point. That is his lowest point. Why? Because he is caught in between these two things. This is the ultimate lukewarm. You follow from a distance and try to see how is the outcome going to be. And if I like it, I'm going to be close enough where I can jump in and take some credit for it. If I don't like it, then I'll just kind of step away, right? It's like the easy pot shots that I think a lot of Christians have moved away from church and pointed out all the flaws in church. How many of you know that churches have flaws? How many of you know that if you really look, this church has flaws? This church is made up of people, and people have flaws. It is a cheap pot shot to stand at a distance where it's safe and just hurl grenades on people. It's a whole other thing to be fully in and say, sometimes we're going to get it right. Hopefully more than we get it wrong, but we're going to follow Jesus, right? And I think there's a question, when are we tempted? Who are we around? What subjects come up on the news where we move a little further away and say, Jesus, I'm going to follow you, but maybe at arm's distance for a little while I figure out what's going to happen in this social issue or that, political campaign or this relationship or, I think it's something that we all have to wrestle with. So I'd just encourage you to write it down as we wrap up. It is 7:31. I'd like to pray for you, but you are always welcome to linger and hang out. If you would like prayer, there's a lot of people here. I would love to pray for you if you'd like that. But let's pray, and then we'll dismiss from there. God, thank you. Thank you for drinking the cup. Thank you that even at our very worst, we look to the left and the right and we find you there with us. And so God, I just pray for myself, but also for all these friends of ours, that you would search us and you would know our hearts. You would convict our hearts of the ways that we follow you from a distance. Maybe even the ways that we deny you, sometimes even without even realizing what we're saying. Would you make yourself known to us in those moments as the one that is gentle and kind, the one that wants to redirect us onto the everlasting path? Thank you that in Jesus that we can find forgiveness and grace whenever we ask for it. So would you reshape our hearts in the ways that we're wounded? Would you help us to continue to heal? Would you put us into positions where our strengths that you gave us come alive. And God, thank you that in that moment you chose to drink it, that your kingdom really can come on earth, that we are gathered here because you did that, and we are in awe of what you've done. So we love you. We ask that you would go before us. You would remind us often of all the things we have simply because of what you have done. Amen.
Thank you.